So yeah, moving along. So today with Unit 3, Lesson 6, we are drafting the extended response. So everything we've been working towards, and quite frankly, for the first two units up to this point, the sort of work to this idea where we're actually drafting the response. All of the sort of reading that we've been doing, focusing on summarizing and finding, evidence and things like that through all those lessons is sort of building up to this point. So the lesson today, by the time we finish, you'll be able to write a draft of your extended response, connect paragraphs to your thesis, write using a logical sequence, use effective transitions, support your thesis with evidence. And we'll use my example. So I was hoping Nilda was here today because I used the Cliff as supporting her argument. In the extended response here. So we'll use this and we'll work through it and show you exactly where we transition, how we lead into paragraphs, and how everything's basically going to look as a completed draft. Now, you'll notice the word draft, right? We're going to get to a point where your first draft should never be your final draft. It's really important. You should save some time when you complete your writing to make sure that you give it a good read through. And if you need to, correct anything, you have some time to do that. And that's going to be a little bit down the road. And I'll explain why we're going to wait to review our draft, which is supposed to be the next lesson. So write a draft of your extended response, connect paragraphs to your thesis, write using a logical sequence, use effective transitions, support your thesis with evidence. So we've worked on these parts individually, right, as components. So today it's just looking at what it's going to look like as we get it all together. And let's see, we got a little bit of audio here.
After analyzing the passages and planning your extended response, you are ready to write the draft. As you write, be sure to maintain a consistent focus, keeping in mind both your purpose, to persuade, and your intended audience, in this case, the GED test scorers. Remember that each paragraph should connect to the thesis as well as to the surrounding paragraphs. Be sure that the paragraphs follow a logical and appropriate order, and use effective transitions to show the relationship among ideas. You should also be sure that the body paragraphs contain enough text evidence from the passages to support your thesis and the points of comparison or contrast you have chosen.
Yeah, so just looking at, putting it all together. And we'll see as we go here. We know these parts individually. We've worked on connecting the thesis to the paragraphs and how the evidence should line up and support our thesis. And then, the logical order. Well, we've talked about that too, as far as like, are we starting with our most important point, our least important point, or just the overall flow, using transitions and things like that to make it all come together into a nice, cohesive response. So let's take a look here. I wish they had shown us this a few lessons ago. So this is what an outline would look like for a point-by-point extended response, which is what we've worked on and what I wrote. I decided to, when I get some extra time, I'm going to write a subject by subject response so you can see that as well. And we'll see an outline for that later also, which we talked about. Basically, you discuss and you give your points for the first passage and then subject by subject. Then you go back, right? The second subject is basically the second passage and you do the same thing. There really should be a Roman numeral 5 here, because we have, Roman numeral 1 is the introduction and thesis, and then as we've done, where we compare or contrast each point, and then in Roman numeral 5 would be your conclusion, where you restate your thesis, give an overview of your evidence, and then sort of wrap up with a good punch to give the reader something to remember. And it says over on the side that this is a point-by-point organizational structure. To organize by subject, add to the outline by repeating points 1 through 3 and repositioning the items marked C. I'll save this image and put that in Google Classroom for us, so you can take a look at that. But that's, basically everything in there, right? That you're stating or explaining the point, and you'll see that in my example. And then you provide examples for both passage 1 and passage 2. And then it says use transitions to connect ideas within and between paragraphs. Each paragraph should connect back to the thesis statement, right? So your evidence, it should all connect. You don't want to go out of bounds with what you're writing in the thesis. So let's move over to the quiz, and we'll work through this sort of piece by piece as we have been doing, but we'll end with a complete extended response. So there is our point by point outline. There's the subject by subject outline is in the workbook, and I'll put that up for you guys as well. So test taking. To show comparison, we've talked a lot about transitional phrases and words. So if you're discussing similarities, by the same token, similarly, and in the same way. And then, of course, to show contrast, you can use however, conversely, or in contrast. And then our first question here, I'll go ahead and work through it here. So it's asking which transition best shows the relationship between two examples that fall under the same point of comparison or contrast. So is it, A, although Cliff favors lecture, Jones favors media; B, Cliff favors lecture and in the same way Jones favors media; C, Cliff and Jones favor lecture and media equally; or D, similarly, Cliff favors lecture and Jones favors media. So in this case, it's A. Yep, A. So that way it's, you're seeing a little bit of contrast there. B is just wordy and just unnecessary. Clifton Jones favor lecture and media equally. No, because they are discussing them differently, right? One is against and one's for. And then similarly, Cliff favors lecture and Jones favors media. That's not a similarity, right? One's favoring one thing and one's favoring the other. So although Cliff favors this, Jones favors this. That's the way to go. So A. And now we're going to get into writing. So here, it's going to take us from the introduction through our paragraphs and into the conclusion. So the introduction and lead. So what they're looking for, right, is the very start. What do you start with? And sort of transitioning to your thesis statement. So what I wrote for the lead in, I used statistic, right? 32% of college students take at least one class online, according to Carl Jones. So that one, strategy of using a statistic, I went with that, and you want to make sure that you reference where the statistic comes from. So in this case, it comes from Jones's passage. So we could say according to Carl Jones for that. So that is our lead. And then as we transition, so you want to start discussing sort of broadly the major idea that's discussed in both passages. So I put, this statistic shows the popularity of online learning. And with the continued improvement of technology, we can expect the trend to grow. You get a little creative there, as long as it's within bounds of the passages. And then I'm starting to transition to the passage. So although online education may seem attractive for many, the phenomenon may come with drawbacks. Right. So now I'm getting into the discussion of the passages of transitioning. And then I introduce the two authors and their discussion. So Carl Jones and Elaine Clift describe the benefits and disadvantages of online education in their passages. So we're moving sort of into a little more detail, and then we wrap it up at the end with the thesis statement. So while Jones argues that online education offers flexibility, Clift, and you'll see I've used that template, right from our earlier lessons. Clift makes a better argument against online education because her personal experience provides a better claim with supporting reasons and evidence. So I hit those 3 points in there that I'm discussing: her claim, her reasons, and her evidence. That's what I chose for this particular draft. So I'm just going to copy and paste our lead and transition part, which is what they're asking for. Paste. Okay. And I'll share that in the chat as well. It's going to be some big text in the chat today. Some big chunky sections here. Okay. So how does everybody understand the flow there and how I move from the lead, the introduction, right? I have that sort of opening statement to inform, the readers what's going to be discussed. You could start with a quote, right? There's several different ways that you could do that. You could start with some type of almost like an anecdote. You could go with like an action where we talked about that, where you're describing a, such and such student is, considering enrolling in an online class. You could go with something like that. And then you can move into, but, there could be drawbacks to online education. And then, you could continue that transition by introducing Clift and Jones. All right. So we good here? This making sense for everyone? Okay. So next step, right? And what's our thesis statement? So that one we've dealt with quite a bit. And so what we'll do here is just drop that in. And you'll notice, right? So the couple important things about the thesis statement, as we discussed, you have to assert a claim, right? You have to use some not, I won't say strong language, but assertive language. You don't want to sort of try to, make a point that they both are great, arguments or anything like that, or they both have their upside. Go straight to the point of, Jones argues that online education offers flexibility. Clift makes a better argument against online education because her personal experience provides a better claim, supporting reasons and evidence. Okay. And you could use any one of those templates that we talked about. This one, it's a little easier because you do get to discuss both authors. You introduce both authors again, and you mention the idea and the argument of both. So in that way, you don't have to reintroduce it again at some point if you're discussing the other author. The reader already knows that what Jones's argument is, and that he's basically pro online education. So let me copy and paste that. Also, I will upload the completed extended response on Google Classroom, so you can take a look at it. And I mentioned when I get some extra time, not only will I write an extended response, I'll use the other set of passages, the Clement and Leung that we looked at, and I'll try to do the subject by subject. In addition, I will annotate this one and hopefully try to get to the other one as well. So when you look at it over in the margins, there will be some notes. So I'll dissect it and show you exactly, okay, this is the lead in, here's the transition, here's the thesis, and I'll do that part by part for each, section of the response. So you can see how they flow together and sort of just some of the overall thinking that goes into that, right? So now we have our thesis statement. And then we're moving to point one. So let me see here. Okay, so point one. Let me show you how that works. So here we go here. Christiane is joining us. Okay. So getting into the first body, okay, and so as it mentioned, you sort of need to explain or introduce the points that you're going to be talking about. So here I say both authors provide claims relevant to the discussion of online education and tackle the subject from different points of view. Okay, so using for my first point, their point of view, right, their major claim, and I give a little explanation, right? So when it's talking about their claim, they're both coming from, addressing this subject, addressing the idea of online education from different perspectives. And you'll see again when we get to the second paragraph how I deal with the next part. So what we drop in there, and I will, I will just do the first sentence there because that's basically the introduction and the so here we go, copy and paste. Okay, there we go. And I'll drop that in the chat as well. There we go. So just like it says there, using that idea of what are you comparing and contrasting, comparing or contrasting. So looking at the case for, the claims, giving a small bit of a definition for what that means, talking about different points of view. Okay, so then we're going to the evidence for passage one. So, what am I using to back up this idea of the point of view of their claims? What does the authors discuss in the passages that I can put in as my evidence? So just to clarify, your evidence isn't necessarily the evidence that the authors use, right? They get into more specific, but for each point that you make, you have to have something to support it. That's just what it's saying. Not necessarily the evidence that the author uses, but the evidence that you use to explain your point. So here we'll add the rest of the paragraph. And when we get to the end here, I'll show you how I start to analyze and add my thoughts on the passage. because we have to also start dealing with why we, are picking one over the other. So Cliff draws on her personal experience for her claim that online education lacks quality materials and requires 3 times the amount of work as teaching in a traditional classroom. Jones, however, right, making that transition, changing gears. Jones, however, takes the perspective of the student and explains the benefits offered by online education, such as flexibility and the opportunity for self-management. Okay, so that's both those claims, right? Jones talking about flexibility and self-management. Cliff believes it lacks quality materials and, basically the amount of time for her that it took. And then I finish up by addressing why I'm choosing Cliff, okay, for this first paragraph. So I add at the end, although Jones's claim of flexibility is relevant and appealing, Cliff's claim and her experience as a professional educator makes a better case against online education. All right. So I'm adding my perspective now, right? Now, this is my point of view on the passages and offering that first detail of why I believe Cliff has the stronger case. Okay. So does that make sense for everyone? This is the one sort of point that they don't address completely in our exercises, right? We talked about evidence, we talked about points and things like that, but making it flow together into your argument. And it only takes a sentence, maybe a sentence or two to explain that. Okay, and that is a pretty tight paragraph right there, right? Our introducing our point by a small explanation, then getting into the evidence that we're using for that, and then wrapping it up with a sort of a conclusion on our perspective. And we'll do that again for the second paragraph. So passage 2, it's going straight to the evidence. Right, so we'll put the whole, or wait a minute, what's going on here? Oh, okay, I see what they have. So they want me to split this all up. Point 2, passage 1, evidence. Okay, so let me backtrack a little bit here. So point 1, and then passage 1, evidence. So we just deal with Cliff. So we'll move Jones to the next text box. Oh, let me do this first. Okay. They really sort of break things down into the tiniest pieces here. And then I'll copy and paste just those individual points in. Okay. Here's Cliff. And then Jones will cut, and I'll paste that here as well. All right. And I'm just going to leave my ending on the evidence for Jones at the end there. Okay. So I forget, they really like to break every piece down here. So point 2. Okay. Moving on. Point 2. All right, so I open with a little bit of a transition, right? In addition to their individual claims. So addressing the reader that I am adding more information, right? And another thing. So in addition to their individual claims, comma, both authors discuss relevant reasons to support their point of view. So we're moving on to reasons now. What are the reasons that they use? And there discussing the point. Okay. And also have an example of transition there. Transitioning from my first paragraph into the second paragraph with a transitional phrase. And then introducing my point, which is their reasons. And I give a small explanation that that's what they use to support their point of view. Evidence. So from passage 1, Cliff, for example. So a little bit more of a transition. For example, found it difficult to communicate with students online without the in-the-moment interaction that accompanies in-class instruction. Okay. Copy. Paste. Copy and paste. Right. So we discussed Cliff's reasons before multiple times, and this is one of her reasons, right? The issue she had with communicating with students, right? She talked about the faceless, no faces, and I lifted. You see, I use quotes there because I lifted that in the moment, which was directly from her language, right? She used that phrase in the moment interaction that accompanies in-class instruction. So there's our evidence for the point, right? The point being the reasons. And that's our evidence, supplying a reason that Cliff does not like online education. Okay. Passage 2 evidence. So moving on, then we go to Jones, and you'll see I use another transition, right? Jones, on the other hand, makes the case that students can complete assignments at time that works best for them. Okay, so we're just going to get to our evidence there. Okay, so that's one of the reasons Jones discusses. Okay. And then I'm going to add our sort of follow-up statement about those two. So here again, I say completing assignments at one's leisure may draw students to online education, but it does not address if the students are receiving proper instruction. So making a case again, because of Cliff's experience, yes, there is flexibility, but does that mean it's quality? Okay, so completing assignments at one's leisure may draw students to online education, but it does not address if the students are receiving proper education. Okay. And that complete paragraph, right? We have an introductory sentence. We go into the body of our paragraph where we explain our reasons, provide the evidence, and then wrap it up with an outro, with a statement that is making the case for Cliff's argument. And then point 3. So again, drop down the next paragraph. So again, sort of another transitional statement. So I mentioned the second paragraph. Along with the reasons provided, both authors use logical evidence to reinforce their claims. Okay, so comparing them basically. Copy. Paste. Clean. And, like we've mentioned, some points may need more explanation. So if you need another sentence, that might be necessary. Here, though, just making the case that they have evidence, which, that doesn't need a lot of explanation, right? Just the idea that they are reinforcing their points of view and reasons with logical evidence. So moving on to Cliff's evidence. And you can see, right, I'm starting every time with Cliff. So I'm using passage 1, and then I go to passage 2 for Jones for the second evidence, right? So that's also the way you want to make sure that you're staying in the same frame. You don't want to start with one time and then go to the other one. It just helps keep a logical flow. So Cliff draws on her personal experience for her evidence by explaining how she was only able to introduce a small amount of material outside of the textbook and was unable to replicate. I should put lectures. Hold on here. See, this is why you proofread, why you edit. The Cliff draws on her personal experience for evidence by explaining how she was only able to introduce a small amount of material outside the textbook and was unable to replicate. And again, I need to edit. Okay, there we go. Copy. And paste. Okay. So there's our evidence from passage 1. Evidence from passage 2. Oh, let me copy that for you guys. And go to Jones, right? So Jones relies on the experience of a student, Rebecca, and explains how she was able to access her professor's notes when she missed class. Okay, right, that was Jones's evidence showing the flexibility and self-management. Copy, paste, okay. And then we'll add our closing point there. And again, so if Rebecca's professor is struggling with teaching online in the same manner as Cliff, the notes she is able to access may lack depth or fully explain a subject. So pointing out here, right, the overall idea that I've been making is, while there's certainly benefits to online education as far as flexibility and time management, so forth. Overall, making the claim here that it may lack quality, right? That's sort of the theme that I've sort of placed in here to help address my argument. All right, so copy, paste. Okay. And that's our 3 paragraphs for our body, the 3 points that we made. Okay. And then we want our conclusion. So we'll put it all in here and then we'll talk about it piece by piece. So you see, I use that transition, right, in conclusion. So I'm alerting the reader that we're wrapping up. What's going to follow is basically me summarizing my thesis and discussing the evidence that I use to support the claim that Cliff makes a better case. So as I copy and paste that, we'll read it over here in the text box here. Clean that up. Okay, so in conclusion, Cliff's convincing point of view and use of reason and evidence makes a more compelling case against online education than Jones' support for it. Cliff's personal experience provides insight into the struggle of teaching online, while her reasons and evidence convince the reader that students seeking online education may sacrifice quality for convenience. Right, so that's wrapping up the entire evidence, right? That's making my statement of how I showed that her personal experience provides insight into the struggle of teaching online. Her reasons and evidence convince the reader that students seeking online education may sacrifice quality for convenience. So there's the summary of my evidence. You may take more than one sentence. You may have 2 or 3 sentences. That's fine. You just want to make sure that you hit all the points. And then, so I use that sort of reaction, sort of putting the reader into that space of online education. So I say, imagine that you are an educator like Elaine Cliff with years of teaching experience. The prospect of teaching classes online may seem attractive, but the reality is far more frustrating when class materials are hard to introduce and preparing for class takes 3 times as long. Right, so just punching in that idea that, okay, there's maybe a strong case here that there's problems with online education, and sort of feeling, remember, thinking about point of view and who her audience is. We, more for teachers, probably, whereas Jones may be speaking to maybe a larger general audience, or certainly more towards students. But at the end there, leaving them something to think about, right? That's the conclusion. You're going to summarize your thesis. I didn't have to really mention Jones all that much. I was making my point that Cliff, offers a more convincing point of view, and reason and evidence makes a more compelling case. Those words, as far as when you're constructing your thesis, convincing, compelling, stronger, right? Those are words you can use when you support that argument. And it's more compelling than Jones's. Simple summary, and then just like it suggests, right, leaving the reader something to think about. You might want to introduce a statistic or something else. Since I used this statistic for the 32% at the beginning, I didn't necessarily want to revisit that. And I just kind of, you could use like another anecdote. If I was writing another one where I was supporting Jones's argument, as opposed to Cliff's, I might use my personal experience with online education, especially when I was an undergraduate. I took several online classes, and I can mention, that helped me get through my degree. So, there's lots of different perspectives here and lots of different angles you can take. So how do you guys feel about that? Does it make sense? Let me put it that way. Do I need to expound on anything, offer any more explanations of how I put that together? I want to say that's a no. Okay, so I'm going to submit here. Okay. We're not going to go through with the workbook because it's just replicating this, and it's wanting to do, it's more engineered to do the subject by subject, and I want to take a little time to make one of those. So here's the plan. Okay, I'm going to change things up a little bit for the next few weeks.